Who was it who said, it was George Santayana, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And repeat it we do over and over again when we don't remember, and take lessons learned from and allow those who reconstruct to put out the big lie. You know, it was in George Orwell, his 1984 novel, where he wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." The context of this slogan in Winston's struggle to maintain, he was the main character you'll recall, to maintain his memory, his vital connection to truth against the evil ambition of an all-powerful party to control what we remember of the past, and through that, to control the pathways into the future. That is also the context in which the Victims of Congress Memorial Foundation carries out its work. It works to ensure that the memories, the real experiences of millions of people who suffered under communism are preserved, notwithstanding the efforts of powerful persons, ideologies, and interests for whom the memory of the horrific crimes of communism must be forgotten or more or less subtly distorted so as to promote their own contemporary agendas. On one level, reluctance to remember the communist crimes might seem as an understandable human weakness. The sheer scale, the magnitude, the barbarity of those crimes is so vast that it beggars our power of comprehension. How could they commit such crimes against women, men, and children? 100 million. And maybe that's an underestimation. Nobody knows for sure. But it's a terrible legacy of communism. And having read many of Karl Marx and Engels' writings, knowing that the undergirding of it was so occultish-based, it's not surprising that they had such animosity towards people of faith in particular, but against people themselves, because the creature was, human beings were superfluous. We've seen it all over the world, as Christine said a moment ago. You know, it is everywhere. It was in the USSR. It crushed or tried to crush the spirit of whole nations. And of course, there were many other countries, including Cuba, but continues to repress. I remember meeting with Armando Valladares, the great human rights campaigner who spent years in prison, the gulag of Fidel Castro, while many on the left were winning Che Guevara shirts and extolling Fidel Castro, particularly in Europe. This man wrote Against All Hope and talked about the horrors visited upon political prisoners. I'll never forget the one time when he said in the book that they took the political prisoners and submerged them in excrement, human excrement, obviously a very debasing and humiliating thing to do. A lot of them got sick, got ear infections, and when later on he was freed and honored by Ronald Reagan in a number of ways, including making him our ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission, and I traveled with him to Geneva to fight for a Cuba resolution to hold that horrific dictatorship to account, which is still a horrific dictatorship. Notwithstanding Obama's opening, things have gotten worse with regards to political prisoners. When later on, we were at a Right to Life concert. I'm very pro-life. I believe in the sanctity of human life from womb to tomb. He said he couldn't even change his children's diapers. He had immediate flashback to that terrible scene when political prisoners were doused and submerged in human excrement. And of course, that was only the beginning of it. There were Ho Chi Minh poles that were used to poke them when they were in prison. Couldn't sleep. You would get jabbed all over the body, including in the private parts, in order to keep you awake and to hurt you. And of course, they beat people unceasingly. You know, the past is prologue. And again, if we don't remember the past, shame on us when it replays again, over and over again in our societies. Rather than dwell today on too many ways in which memory of the communist crimes have been obliterated, retouched, you do that so brilliantly, let's consider one thing that is common to most, if not all of them. They deny the profound spiritual significance of the victims' experiences, trivialize it, brush it aside, particularly post-PTSD and other consequences psychologically endured. I've written 4 laws on the issue of torture. The first one was called the Torture Victims Relief Act. And after hearing from these wonderful people all over the world, especially in communist dictatorships, which especially when we wrote it, were even with the USSR, we're still in there, the pain that they carry, the sleepless nights, remembering being in that solitary confinement. I remember Father Calciu in Romania, who we all worked on. Bob Dole did great work on his behalf, so did I, and so did Frank Wolf. And of course, he was put into a prison under Nicholas Ceausescu in Romania because he preached against atheism. So Ceausescu at one point put him in a coffin. I'm claustrophobic. I don't know how. It was through the grace of God and his indomitable spirit that Father Calciu endured that. And when Ceausescu finally realized it was time to get rid of Father Calciu, he put 2 thugs into his prison cell. And they were real thugs. They were people who committed real crimes, and said, you kill Calciu, you get a better deal in terms of prison sentencing. Your jail term will be reduced. He starts preaching the gospel. They tell him, we're in here to kill you. He preaches the gospel. And almost like in St. Paul's, in the Acts and other parts of his epistles, you get people who are turning their lives to God and then going on to a longer prison sentence, but having found faith. And Father Calciu was that kind of individual, a true saint, in my opinion. No one has more eloquently called us back to this problem of communism than Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In 1983, the great writer received the Templeton Prize, in which he made for his honor and for making great contributions, obviously, to the cause of freedom and liberty. And he said, and these very short quote, more than half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened, he said. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I have read hundreds of books, this is Solzhenitsyn, of course, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own towards the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened. Of course, remember the infamous scene when he spoke to Harvard. They didn't like what he had to say in that great commencement ceremony some years back. Solzhenitsyn recalled us forcefully to the spiritual values that were always at stake in communist dictatorships and its assault on humanity, and remain at stake in the struggle to maintain the memory of what communism perpetrated on peoples who fell victim to it. Over my many years in Congress, and I've been in Congress for 37 years, I've been blessed to meet and work with many men and women who have been great living witnesses to human rights, fundamental freedoms, and efforts to maintain the true memory of the crimes of communism. It's no coincidence that most of them have also been witnesses to God and came into conflict with communism for that very reason. 37 years ago, during my first term, I read Tortured for Christ by Romanian pastor Richard Wurmbrand. It is the true story, as you know, of unspeakable physical torture and psychological abuse of underground Christians under Romania's dictator, Nicholas Ceausescu, and his 14-year jailing. Wurmbrand had defied the communists by declaring openly that communism and Christianity were incompatible. Sabina, his wife, stood by him and also suffered prison and forced labor for her faith. 1964, the Wurmbrands were ransomed out of Romania, and he testified before Congress in a great scene, took off his shirt and say, here's some of the markings of what this dictatorship did to me. And this is commonplace. Pastor Wurmbrand also said in the book that after being drugged, because they so often using psychotropic drugs, and beaten, he was in such bad shape that he even forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer. So he simply prayed, Our Father, I've forgotten the prayer, but you surely know it by heart. Russia. Don Ritter is here, who used to be the ranking member on the Helsinki Commission and a great, great champion of human rights. I'll never forget when he put together a trip, and I joined him on that trip, to Vilnius, when the Russian Black Berets went into Vilnius, when President Landsbergis, a great, great guy, the man, the leader, was in his parliament building, and the Black Beret Russian troops had already stormed several areas, including a TV tower. They mowed down several people. There was a tank there. There were candles, people praying the rosary around the fallen, innocent victims of this atrocity by Moscow. So we went up there, and we were there for one reason. We were there to be physically present so that the Black Berets wouldn't invade Landsbergis' parliament building and take him and kill him or do whatever they might do to the rest of those who supported democracy. Well, Don Ritter, we go to this TV tower. There's a tank sitting right there, troops, full battle gear, and there's a line that you can't cross. So what does Don Ritter do? Steps over the line and walks, gets right near the tank, and the turret turns. And I remember I and others said, "Hey, Don, they're going to shoot you. They're going to shoot you." He waited, did not do a quick, and then walked over the line again. We really believed that that trip, and we were joined by some Poles and some other Eastern Europeans who wanted to make their physical presence there, that we're here, standing by President Landsbergis. But Don, thank you for that. That was a heroic act, and I'll never forget that turret turning towards you. My first trip to the Soviet Union was in 1982 with the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And while we're there, we met with Alexander Lerner, who was a very, very prominent refusenik. And then we met with many other families, including Sharansky's mother, who pleaded to us to get her medical help for her son, who was incarcerated. And that was one of the first of many, many, many trips to the Soviet Union and to prison camps. And I'll never forget, we met with the Pentecostal Seven, and what a mixed bag in our own embassy. Some people wanted them there, the Siberian Seven that made their way across the Russian line, the guards, the big burly guards, and all of them didn't make it. And it took about 5 years before they were able to get their visas. Ronald Reagan had their backs completely because he understood the evils of communism, but he also made sure that they were taken care of despite some pushback from some of the Foreign Service officers. But again, I began to grasp, even on that trip, which was reinforced over and over again over the years, that Solzhenitsyn had it right in the Gulag Archipelago when he said it is militant atheism. It's not that they don't believe in God. It's that they hate God. And they hate, again, human life as well. And I've seen that God hatred all over the world. Multiple trips to the People's Republic of China, getting into Beijing prison number 1. Frank Wolf and I got into it very soon after Tiananmen Square. Great political activists, shaved heads. They looked like concentration camp victims. And they were making jelly shoes and socks for export to the United States. Because that violated Smoot-Hawley, Frank and I picked up a copy of what they were getting, got it to customs, and they put an import ban on it. That gulag closed, only to be reopened for sure somewhere else. So the Laogai system, reformed through labor, which they claim to have gotten rid of, which is a joke, they have not, continues to repress with particular focus on the underground Christian church and also the Falun Gong, the Uyghurs, and the Tibetan Buddhists. Again, this whole idea that anything that's transcendental beyond communism and this militant atheism is a threat to power, and that's why they so aggressively attack it. There are so many great people. One I met in 1994, and then I will conclude on this. Bishop Xu Baoding of Baoding province had spent years, a couple of decades, when I met him in the Chinese gulag, the Laogai. He had been tortured, he had been beaten. It showed on his face, and I'm sure it showed in a lot of other places. And his witness for the Lord, and this goes for the evangelical churches, it goes for the others, the courage is just almost otherworldly, how they defy all of it in order to stand up for their faith and for their fellow human beings. Well, this great man, we celebrated Mass for our delegation, and at the end of it, I asked him about his experiences, but also, how do you feel about the Chinese government? He says, I pray for them every day. I pray for the victims first, but I pray for the perpetrators of these crimes. And he said, like our Lord on the cross, who looked down at his tormentors and killers and forgave them, Father, they forgive them, they know not what they do. I was in awe of this man. When I looked at his eyes, I couldn't believe the clarity. Despite all of that, his mind was absolutely lucid and smart. He was a very, very smart man. And then a couple of years later, he was rearrested, sent back to the Laogai, and we have not heard from him since. The Joseph Kung Foundation tried repeatedly. Other bishops, obviously for him and for many others, have tried repeatedly. Now, why is this so important? And I think I'm running out of time. Am I? Why is this so important? China is on a tear, a race to the bottom today with Pyongyang and North Korea when it comes to religious freedom. I co-chair the China Commission. Paul Protek is here, he was our chief of staff, but it changes every year, House, Senate, every 2 years, I mean. So Marco Rubio is the chairman this year, and we're joined at the hip working on these human rights issues. Well, our latest report will chronicle, you ought to read it, it's online, or we can get you copies. And I went over there last year and gave a major speech on religious freedom and human rights. I can't believe they let me in, because they barred me from the Olympics and I finally got a visa. Xi Jinping now has not just the atheistic public Bureau of Atheism tracking things. He's got the public military, public security doing it. He's made it worse. Any contacts with outsiders, any kind of connection with co-religionists is not just frowned upon and is actionable, and more prison time could be meted out against those individuals. And yet, despite this, arguably, the greatest numbers of Christians in the world reside in China. There are those estimates that suggest that. I think they're probably true. Having gone and met with many house pastors over the years in China, always with their full, we want you to come, and Bob Fu from China Aid has helped us work through that one so we don't go and put a target on their back. But when you talk to these individuals, they are on fire with faith. They love God, and they think the future of China is a democracy and a place where people love, honor, and serve God. And if they decide another faith or religion, that needs to be fully recognized and accepted, like if they're Falun Gong or some other spiritual dimension. So our prayers, and again, memory helps us learn the lessons from the past, which is what you're doing so brilliantly, so that we don't repeat these in the future, because too many people just surface appeal. And again, I am troubled when I see polls saying millennials think that, well, maybe communism or socialism isn't so bad. Try living under it. Try having faith. Try deviating from the Communist Party line, the dictatorship, and find yourself knocked in the head, beaten, and otherwise abused. So thank you for what you're doing to make us all more aware so that this helps us mobilize to prevent it in the future. Thank you.